Hello, I believe we should be live. Welcome to our fourth webinar in the series, Quantitative Research Methods in Eurasian Studies, presented by the Eurasia Program of the Social Science Research Council. Excuse me. My name is Denise Mishwitz, and I'm Program Coordinator at the SSRC, and our speaker today is James Zaviska, who is an alumni of our program, an outgoing committee member, and also on the faculty at the University of Arizona. Today's presentation, Grantwriting to Support Quantitative Research in Eurasian Studies, should take about an hour. Everyone should see a control panel. It's usually on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a questions tab. Over the course of the webinar, feel free to type in any questions that you have. We are going to stop to take a break to take questions throughout the webinar and also have time at the end also for questions. So you can send those in whenever you have them. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. The webinar instructor, James Zaviska, is a sociologist at the University of Arizona who has won multiple nationally competitive awards to support both quantitative and qualitative research in Eurasia, including support from NSF, SSRC, NCEEER, and Fulbright-Hays. She has also advised multiple graduate students on successful grant applications. Professor Zaviska is currently fielding a large survey of housing in Russia in collaboration with Ted Gerber of the University of Wisconsin. They have also just been awarded a large grant to conduct a related comparative study in 4 countries of Eurasia. So before I hand it over to Jane, we're going to do a few polls. On your screen, you should see a question appear, and if you could just quickly answer that question so we can get a sense of what's going on with the audience. So hopefully now you're seeing the first question. And this is, what is your current position? Okay, right now 72% of people have responded, and we have 45% graduate students, 19% untenured professors, 10% tenured professors, 19% researchers, and 10% other. So thank you guys very much. Our second question. This is, have you ever applied for an external grant of any kind with a budget of at least $10,000? So I'll give you all a second to answer that. All right, answers are coming in. Thank you. Okay, 88% of people have answered, and Jane, it is 50-50. 50% yes, 50% no. And we have one final question. Have you ever applied for an external grant to support quantitative research? Here it comes. So external grants. Okay. So we have 90% of people, and 64% say no, 36% say yes. Okay, so thank everyone for your answers, and with that, I'm passing it over to Jane.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, Denise, can you just talk me through this clean screen? I don't see the option.
Oh, don't worry about that. It's fine.
Don't worry about it. Okay.
It looks good.
All right. Okay. So thanks a lot. I'm really pleased to be able to conduct this webinar. Let me just get into slideshow mode here. So I want, most of you, it sounds like, are either graduate students or at earlier stages in your careers. So this presentation, I'm going to assume that's kind of my modal participant, but I hope that there will be things of value in this for people who have more experience. I want to start just by thinking about, like, why would you want to develop a quantitative research agenda? Because applying for external funding is so much work, and the risks are, are high, as are the rewards, that you really want to have a long-term plan and think about whether it's something you want to do. So, you can have a quantitative research agenda, obviously, without funding, but it means you have to work with data that already exists and that is free, or at least cheap enough that you can afford to pay for it with your own resources. I think I want to start with thinking about, like, what would you need funding for? So the prototypical case is you're applying for a grant to conduct your own survey. But that's not the only kind of thing that you can apply for grant funding for, and that is also the most costly thing you could apply for funding for. So you might actually want to buy secondary data, and that's something that I've done with a relatively small external grant in the past. Not all data that's out there that you might want to use is free. You might need to buy equipment. It depends on the agency, but usually you can only pay for software or hardware if it's specifically to support the grant, as opposed to just a general computer for your use and your job. But I've on almost all my grants been able to at least get some software and sometimes hardware into the budget. You also may want to buy time, and the further you get in your career, the more that becomes actually your most valuable commodity. Of course, it also becomes more expensive to buy your time as your income goes up. But for those of you who are faculty, course releases, but even graduate students might be wanting to apply for funding to support a research assistant of their own, especially if you're doing field work in the region. It can be very helpful to have a project coordinator of some kind on the ground, especially when you can't be there. And then for those of you who are on the job market or trying to get tenure, some institutions, some more than others, really value external grants, and so just instrumentally it can be a very good CV builder to get some of those grants on your CV. But we need to be realistic, so I'm going to tell you about my own trajectory, kind of how I got to where I can get the kind of larger grants that I'm starting to get. And so you want to start small, and this I think is the dilemma for how do you become the kind of researcher that's competitive for large grants. The money begets money, so you typically are not going to get a big grant if you've never had a grant before. And also, probably actually those previous grants are one of the best predictors, and that's partly, a selection effect in that people who write one high-quality grant are more likely to write another one. But it's also that agencies like to see, that the people they're funding have been successful in the past, and that success could be measured through previous grants. It could also be your publication record, maybe the institution you're at. Although I want to say about institutions that I've heard many times people say. People who are at smaller universities, liberal arts places, or universities which are research universities but not at the top tier, not even try to apply for grants because they just assume that the grants only go to the faculty at elite institutions, and that's actually not empirically true. What really matters to the grant givers is that they're going to get something useful for their money, and the institution can be useful, but it's certainly not the most important factor. So don't be discouraged if you're not at a big R1 university at this stage. And then, so I say be realistic in terms of starting with small, but the reason I mention a longer-term agenda is you can think about, and you can even craft your grant applications for the smaller grants you apply for earlier in your career as what people in the grant writing kind of field called leveraging grants, meaning it's sort of an investment, and if an agency can give you a small amount of money but anticipate that it might lead to bigger grants, that's good for them too, and it's good for you. So when you're applying for the smaller grants, you want to give the funder a sense of how you see your longer term goals. So I'm just going to tell you about my trajectory. So I started out, as a graduate student, and I had 2 grants to support my dissertation research. The first was a Fulbright-Hays, which, mainly, I think the amounts for Fulbright-Hays is much larger now, but this is, I don't know how many years ago when I think about it. But it was to support, that actually grant supported the qualitative and historical component of my dissertation, which was also how I generated hypotheses that I wanted to test with a survey. And so when I applied for the NSF, it was nice to be able to say to the funder that I had already, and I hadn't even done the Fulbright research, but I'd lined the money up. So I could say to NSF, I've already secured funding to do essentially what we would call, the pilot research or the exploratory research that was going to be the foundation of the survey that I hope to do. And I was able to do at the time a survey in one city in Russia of 1,000 people, working with a very high-quality Moscow-based research institution for about $20,000. And that's a little more than a dissertation improvement grant typically funds, although they will often give you a supplement for international research. And then I was able to get my home institution to top it off with a few thousand more to make it possible. So that's the other way you can do things. You can try to combine sources when you're at the graduate level, because collecting data is costly. But again, you can do it for relatively little. These are realistic numbers for a graduate student to aim for. After I was an assistant professor, I applied and received an SSRC postdoctoral fellowship. And this was to support pilot research, qualitative research for what I hoped would be my next large study, which did wind up happening, and that has come out. The results are in my book, Housing the New Russia. And so this project was, the idea for it came out of it was my dissertation, but it was not my dissertation. My dissertation was about consumption. This was about housing. And then I applied after I got the SSRC, which is basically is a leveraging grant for NCEEER, which I think stands for National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, to pay for, again, for qualitative data collection and to purchase quantitative data. At that time, the Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey you had to pay for. It's actually free again, but that I needed that data to do what I wanted to do. And so, again, when you apply for grants that are thinking about a longer-term agenda, you also want to be able to communicate to the funder that, what they're paying for now is also, going to have some kind of a, that there's going to be a tangible outcome of some kind from that. And so, again, I was able to get the book out of just the data I collected with these, again, relatively modest sums. That did not allow me to collect the kind of national survey I would have liked to have been able at the time, but was good enough to do some pretty interesting research that then led to hypotheses that I was able to use as the basis for my first large grant from the National Science Foundation. And I should say that these two grants I've gotten in the last 2 years are both collaborative with Ted Gerber, who's a full professor at the University of Wisconsin, has a much longer CV than I do in every respect, and that's also another great way to build your career as a survey researcher is to work with more senior people. Now you have to give them some incentive to want to work with you. So with Ted as well, I think at this stage I had the credibility with him and also with funders that I had ideas that were worth having both senior level faculty and these larger grant giving institutions to support. So that collaboration has been really wonderful, and we now just received a much larger grant to extend this, basically the methodology from the NSF. So with the NSF, we make an argument that the housing regime in Russia can be thought of as a quasi, there's a quasi-experimental distribution of wealth, and then we look at the effects of unequal wealth distribution on, in this case, demographic outcomes. And the next grant, we're looking at political outcomes instead of demographic outcomes. But again, the idea is that we've already shown that we have this, basic sort of research design insight. We've tested it out. We've already designed a related survey to do this, and now we're ready to really run with this on a larger scale. And the only reason I can't announce it is that just that the funder has asked us not to until they're prepared to make public announcements. That should be soon. Okay, so enough about me. I just want to give you, so you could visualize, what it's, how you get to, from graduate student to large grants, if that's what you want to do. So, and I want to think about what are the kinds of quantitative research that would warrant external funding. This is related to the, why would you want to apply for funding? But so again, we think about collecting original survey data as that's kind of the the ultimate goal or the gold standard. It's nice because it's wonderful to collect your own survey data because you can design your own measures to measure whatever it is that you think is important to measure. So those of you who worked with secondary data, I'm sure have had the experience where you wish a certain question had been asked and it wasn't. Actually, even when you collect your own data, you'll find it's inevitable. You'll also wish later that you'd asked a certain question you didn't think of. But you obviously have more control over what kind of data you have when you're the one who can collect it. But it's also very expensive. It takes a ton of time. There's a long, long startup period before you can actually get any results. I mean, even with the NSF grant, we still, it took us so long just developing the survey instrument and pilot testing it that, we're just about to go into the field now with that, so we still don't actually have the data back. And for that reason, it's risky, both for the researcher and for the funder. You don't know what the outcome's going to look like, and the other thing is, once you've collected that data, unless you get a new grant, there's no going back. So it's a very kind of high cost, high risk, high reward, strategy. Another intermediate option, which you might just think about as junior scholars, is to try to piggyback onto an existing survey. Ideally, this would be your advisor has a big grant to do a survey, and they're going to let you add a few of your own questions on it. Now that's probably not true for most of you. But you might also, and again, this is probably for if you're a little more senior than a graduate student, but once you have some kind of a track record as a survey researcher, you can think about approaching long-standing, survey organizations that do. So, for example, Ted Gerber works a lot with the Levada Center, adding questions onto their so-called omnibus surveys. So they have a kind of standard survey that they do, annually. They have other ones they do monthly, and you can pay to have a supplement added onto their survey. So you get their basic measures they've already worked out. The field processes, they've got the research team in place, they've got the questions designed for, standard background variables. Now, that means you're constrained to use their measures for the things that they would normally put on there anywhere, but it's much cheaper to add on to their survey. And so Ted, as I recall, his first NSF grant was exactly this kind of survey, and it was relatively cheap. I think it was about a $50,000 grant, and it bought him a bunch of questions on one of those omnibus surveys. You also, and I think that people should apply for this more often than they do, you can also apply for funding for new uses for existing data. So you don't have to collect your own data to think that you can apply for a grant to support quantitative research. So, for example, if you are somebody who is familiar with multi-level modeling, you might have an idea for combining regional level data with existing individual level data to run, to fit models, sometimes called hierarchical linear models, but basically that look at the interaction between kind of the larger level regional context and the individual level. So I know people that work in, not in Eurasia, but just in sociology anyway, that get grants to do this kind of thing all the time. So now here the burden is higher for, your innovation has to be, it's going to be analytical, right? It's going to be, well, it's going to be combinatorial and analytical as opposed to the creation of a new resource. Although, of course, you're not going to get money to collect your own data either unless you have an analytical as well as a sort of data type innovation. Just thinking about kinds of funding, and most of you will probably be familiar with this, but just to make sure. Okay, so there is area studies funding. Unfortunately, those are smaller grants, and there's not a lot of money out there that's allocated for the Eurasian region specifically for doing grants, with the exception of for those of you that are not in academia or thinking about non-academic careers. There are organizations, let's say like the World Bank or USAID, that may you can do contract work with, for they want to have a survey done in a certain place and they're willing to pay for it. But what I'm talking about here is more applying for surveys to follow your own research agenda as opposed to a contract for somebody else. But there is a fair amount of money out there, but you sort of have to be in that world to even know how to get it. Then there is some funding out there that is oriented toward international or comparative studies. So the Fulbright is a good example of that. And although they're smaller, those typically are fellowship. That's typically allocated as a fellowship as opposed to a grant that is to support you being somewhere. They're often large enough to where you can use that plus maybe the smaller supplement from your own institution to do a small-scale survey. Graduate students find ways to do this. There's also a lot of money right now coming from the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, and you might be surprised at the kinds of things they're funding. A lot of it is stuff that we would expect maybe to be more in the State Department, but they're funding a lot of basic research right now in social science. So the Minerva Research Initiative is kind of their signature grant for social sciences, but there's people, like I said, if you're doing stuff on social networks, there are people working on networks with defense funding from some of these other initiatives. So again, those are not really for graduate students. That's for more when you're further along in your career. But many of those grants come with few strings attached in terms of it's open source, the data is open, and you set your research agenda, you do what you want to. You just have to frame it in such a sense that they think it's worth it for the, it will help national security somehow to answer your research questions in the way that you want to. Then there are the basic social science grants. The large national funders, NSF and National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health are the largest ones. And these are both have some funding for graduate students and are the kind of the main place where disciplinary research is done, meaning you apply to a program in your discipline, sociology, political science, etc. And then finally, and this takes a lot, this takes searching around and just paying attention to where people who are doing research in your substantive field, maybe not in Eurasia, but in your substantive field, are getting their money. So for example, if you know education, if you do education research and you pay attention to the footnotes of where people are getting money to do their education research, the Spencer Foundation name comes up a lot. MacArthur Foundation has all kinds of topical research, and the topics that they're interested in shift. So for example, actually I applied for this and didn't get it, but they actually had a topic on, it was a call for proposals to test causal effects of housing on whatever else, on various outcomes. So, you just want to keep your eye open for those kinds of opportunities as well. Okay, so I'm going to just put up a couple of slides, which is just on a general, just not oriented toward quantitative or Eurasian sort of advice, which I'll get to later, but especially if you've never applied for a proposal, a grant, or if you've never been successful, shall we say. The SSRC actually has a wonderful it's like a pamphlet on how to write proposals, and it's sort of pitched toward graduate students, but the advice in there, I reread it every year. I just find it really useful, and I use it for teaching my undergraduate students on how to write proposals. So that's great. The NIH also has it's like this FAQ called Writing a Great Grant Application. And it's a little more clunky because it's in an FAQ format, but it has some very good advice, and it's geared toward quantitative proposals, surveys, experiments, that kind of thing. So that's really useful as well. And again, the advice there applies beyond just NIH. And then the other thing that I strongly recommend you do when you decide to write a proposal is find out who's gotten those grants recently, contact them and ask them if they're willing to share their proposal with you. I do that routinely, and most people are willing to. I've had a couple people say no, but most people will say yes. And also, if you're at a research university, R1 research university, find out what kind of internal resources there are and take advantage of them. So, for example, here where I am at the University of Arizona, we have a wonderful, it's called the Social and Behavioral Sciences Research Institute, that runs workshops continuously on whether it's telling you about new funding opportunities, giving advice on how to, just general grant writing. They'll actually help you edit your proposals if you get to them early enough. And they even have small leveraging grants. And a lot of other universities have this kind of thing too. And they are often less competitive than you think, because people don't often plan far enough ahead when they're writing proposals to give themselves time to take advantage of those resources, which leads me to my next, this is the main generic advice I'll get is, do your homework. Treat this as like a several-month process. You are simply not going to get a competitive grant to do a survey research or any research, really competitive national grant that's thrown together at the last minute. This is not a random assignment process. It's just it's so competitive that you're just not going to be successful unless you're really, really thorough. And at the same time, I think that also is what makes my approach to grant writing different from many of the people I know, and why I've been so successful. I mean, my hit rate on grants is very high, but I haven't applied for very many. And that's because I just am very, very thorough about how I do it. And having also been as a reviewer now on a lot of different grant competitions, you can be in the top 50th percentile if you just follow the instructions and proofread your draft and just really make a good effort, because about half of what we see is it just looks slapped together and you just don't even want to read it. So it doesn't take a lot to actually just get yourself into that top half just by doing that. So especially when you're doing quantitative research, you want to review not just literature, but what data is already out there. Because one of the things you're going to have to do if you want to get funding to create a new data set is convince the funder why it can't be done with data that's already out there. But again, because it's so costly. You want to show that not only your proposal, your ideas, but also if you want to collect new data, your data itself is something novel. Give yourself lots and lots of time, and also for those who've never done this, just know that for these national grants, there's almost always an internal deadline that is earlier than the grant-giving agency's deadline, and that's because your institution is going to want to do its own review of what you're applying for, because you're using the institution's name and you're making claims about the institution's sort of capacity to support the research. The institution is going to have to manage the grant. So again, I know too many sad stories of people who wrote this wonderful NIH proposal and then didn't understand that they needed to get in touch with their sponsored projects office at the university at least 2 weeks in advance just to get the process going, and turn it in a week before to get it in. So find out well in advance what that process looks like. Similarly, if you're going to be doing quantitative research that involves either an intellectual collaboration or a collaboration with people who are going to help you with the field work, you need to identify who those collaborators are going to be and get them to both give you letters of support that you need to support with the application, but also you're going to need those people's help in putting the proposal together itself. So you're going to want to give them a draft well in advance. You're going to want to ask them to help you put your budget together, and that's also stuff that can't really be done the night before. All right. The other thing that you can do to really improve radically your chances of success are to research the funder. So what is the purpose of a given grant, and are you eligible? That's another thing, is people sometimes will waste their time applying for things that really are either, well, they're just literally not eligible because they don't have the right nationality or something like that, but also it's just you're applying for something that they're just not interested in, they're not going to support. You want to read the selection criteria, and this is a nice tip, is see if you can find the instructions for reviewers on what they're supposed to be evaluating you for. Sometimes that's more detailed or different than what the instructions for the applicants are. So like, for example, for NSF, you can actually get online and find, there's like a handbook for reviewers on what questions they're supposed to answer and how they're supposed to rate your rate proposals that they're reviewing. And so then if you can find out what those are, then what you can do is you can structure your proposal itself around the criteria. You can think about, well, the reviewer is going to read it. They're going to be checking off. Did they do X, Y, Z? How well did they do X, Y, Z? Make sure they can find X, Y, and Z in your proposal easily. Many times you can actually find out who the reviewers are. And if it's public information, there's nothing wrong with finding out who they are and what their tastes are. And you don't want to drop in tons of gratuitous references, but you want to make sure that you're writing to them as your audience. And so it helps to know who they are. At least if you don't know who specifically they are, the kinds of reviewers are. What kind of disciplines might they come from? What sort of jobs are they in now? And then also, what are the funders' broader priorities? This is something else I see people often don't do, but that can really help. So, it's not just what is the purpose of the grant, but what does the funder itself want to accomplish? So especially when you're looking at foundations. That can really help you if you can allude to how your proposal will not only do whatever the grant is supposed to do, but will also dovetails with or fits with the larger mission of the institution. That helps. And then finally, who are the funders' own funders? So for example, I did not know until recently that the SSRC Eurasia Program is funded by the State Department, and actually so is the NCEEER, and so is IREX, and all that money for the Area Studies has almost all of it at these national institutions comes ultimately from the State Department. And so, the funder, in your case, SSRC or NCEER, has to make the case to their own funder, the State Department in this case, about why they should keep giving them money to allocate these grants. Okay, because often the agency that you apply to a grant for is actually an intermediary who's been essentially contracted with to make decisions about allocations of funding to fit a broader mission of some other larger agency. So knowing that can help you with your pitch. Okay, so what do I mean by pitch? I'm going to talk about two different ways of pitching research. So first, pitching a quantitative research agenda to a Eurasian Studies audience. And again, I'll just back up and say, unfortunately, there's not a lot of money to do that, but especially for those of you who are graduate students, there is money still that is realistic for you to apply for, that is area studies oriented, because these tend to be smaller grants. So that's what makes it realistic. So I just mentioned the State Department. You know, the State Department's call for proposals that organizations like SSRC and NCEEER applied for actually have called for more quantitative research on the region. So you actually can have an edge, and if you make that point. You also you can try to appeal to the Eurasian Studies audience through either the novelty or the sort of the science, that it's more social sciencey or more hard sciencey. Just because the reason I say this is that the review panels for Eurasian Studies type fellowships typically are interdisciplinary and are going to have a lot of anthropologists and maybe sociologists that are more ethnographic, historians, even people that are in literary studies, who are not going to know about or care about quantitative research. But they will feel open to the idea that it's worth doing, especially if you can show how you're going to build on whatever area expertise is out there, whether it's your own because you've done field work or that you've read in the field and you know what's out there to develop hypotheses that a survey would help to test. The other thing you want to do, and maybe for this audience I don't need to say this, but I'm not sure if all of you do have a strong background in Eurasian Studies, so just in case you don't, you want to demonstrate your regional knowledge and commitment. So having been on review panels, we get proposals where it looks like the person just really wanted to get funding to study, social networks as a, general theoretical process. And they're just kind of, applying anywhere they can think of to do a survey on social networks. So they don't really care about where it's done. And so they're going to get in and get out of the region, right? And so they're just applying because it's just one more thing to apply for. That's not going to be successful. So if you say, I want to come and study, social networks in Russia because we know that it's been important for job networks, and I'm a specialist on job networks. And this is going to be another case. This is an interesting case for building theory in social networks. But you don't show any other intention of contributing to the field of Eurasian Studies. That's not going to be successful. So somehow you want to signal your commitment to further study, and that could be because of work you've already done. It could be how you frame the broader impact of the work that you plan to do for scholars in the region. The other thing to just be aware of is that reviewers will flag and be very skeptical of your application if you don't know the regional languages. So if you don't know them, you need to be upfront about that and explain why you don't need them. Maybe for what you're doing, it's going to be adequate to work with a bilingual translator. You can develop the instrument in English. I mean, that's a hard sell. But if you don't even acknowledge that it might be a problem, then they're going to think that you just have no idea what you're doing. Also, because of the interdisciplinary nature, you don't want to assume any knowledge of statistics. So, you want to use, if you can, put hypotheses and especially statistical models in graphical terms. But you also want to, signal to the people on the panel who may have quantitative backgrounds that you're familiar with, that you're capable of writing a more technical proposal, that you've just chosen not to do that. And there you can use, your citations and your footnotes and appendices if they're allowed. Now I'm going to turn to the other way, though, which is probably going to be the more longer term. What you'll need to do if you want to have any shot at larger scale grants is you need to pitch the Eurasian context to, non-regional audiences, I should say non-area studies audiences. So the question you need to ask yourself, because this is what they're going to be asking themselves, why should the funder care about your research if they don't care about your region? You have to make the case. So in my case, if they don't care about Russia, Why should they care about my study of housing in Russia? What is it going to do to advance knowledge in a particular discipline? And so there are various ways of doing this, and I'll just tell you some of the ones that I've used. You can, now the theoretical advantage of a context is, can be very successful for non-area studies audiences. So, for example, in my own work on housing, it's really hard to identify the causal effects of housing on anything else. Homeownership, for example, because homeowners tend to be systematically different than others. So, for example, we know that homeowners are, children of homeowners are more likely to go to college in the U.S. Well, is homeownership really what's causing them to go to college? Probably not. Although it might, actually, well, these days it might prevent them from going because there's no equity left in the home. But in normal times, in a normal housing market, it could be that the homeownership experience itself does have an effect because maybe children have more of a sense of security in their own home, and that affects how they study. But it could also just be that, well, homeowners tend to be wealthier. And the same kinds of people who will invest in a home are going to invest in their kids' college. So that's the classic, correlation with that causation problem. So we make the argument that in Russia, because of privatization and the sort of very slow development of kind of functional credit markets and rental markets, that you have, it's not a true experiment, but you have a kind of a natural experiment where younger generations' access to housing depends more on inheritance than it does on, say, their labor market position. And so we make the argument that because of this, we can test theoretical hypotheses about homeownership effects but in a way that will at least mitigate these these problems of selection effects. The other way that you can talk about theoretical advantage is you can leverage the interesting cross-national variation in the region. This is for really large and expensive surveys, although again, if maybe you're just applying for funding to use a secondary survey that's already cross-national. You've got, all these places have something in common, which is post-Soviet, sort of context and the shared Soviet history. But there's a lot of variation, and maybe that variation is theoretically interesting. So, for example, you can have more and less authoritarian regions that you might want to test. That, what the degree to which the country is authoritarian then affects the kinds of individual level effects you might be interested in a survey. It could also be, proximity to Europe, whatever. There's lots of, ways that you can use that cross-national variation in ways that allow you to test theoretical hypotheses. You might also, so this is going to be critical, actually, I think, to getting somebody like NSF or NIH to fund research over in that region. You're going to have to show that there's a theoretical payoff. It can also help, it's not enough, but it'll help your case to also talk about logistical advantages. So the cost of labor is much cheaper. You can do large-scale surveys for less than it would cost to do them here. So, for example, with the size of the sociology program grants at NSF, there's no way that you can do a national survey in the U.S. with an NSF grant. It just won't happen. But you can do one in Russia. You also might argue that this region shares characteristics of other parts of the world that might be of interest, but that we can't really go do a lot of survey research in right now. So, so basically authoritarian, some authoritarian regions. Although, unfortunately, Russia has suddenly become pretty closed to survey research. If you Google news about the Levada Center, Levada, you'll know what I'm talking. You'll see what I'm talking about. But in most of the region, you can still do survey research with a foreign grant. And that's not true maybe in, let's say, Northern Africa or something like that. You can also try to convince them they should care about the region. So this is especially for the topical type funding, like education or interest in health or whatever. But whatever they're interested, maybe even if the funder is mainly interested in the U.S., maybe they're interested in national security, and so you can argue that, or just global security, that this region is really critical for security, and so knowing more about them, will help. You can, relate it to humanitarian concerns that, this is a part of the country. Let's say the rapid decline in birth rates, or really, really high rates of sudden rise in HIV rates, that kind of thing. So you can make them think that the region is more important than maybe they realized it was for whatever their pet topic is. You can also relate it to the natural resources, market economies, environment, that kind of thing. So before I move on, I want to just stop there and see if there are any questions. The next part of it, I'm going to go into kind of like how do you actually craft a proposal and what kinds of things need to go into it.
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can type those in now. We had one question a while ago, and that's a general question, asking if the slides are going to be available after the webinar. And yes, they will be. The slides and a recording will be posted on our website, and I'll be sending everyone a link to that after the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. And also, just to mention that all of the previous webinars that I've done, there are 3 other ones, some of which may be useful to those of you who are thinking about applying for grants, are also available online. There's one on sampling and sample design. There's one on measurement validity across, so sort of developing the comparability of measures across different regional contexts. I can't remember anymore what the third one was. Retrospective data, like course research, collecting retrospective data and analyzing it. Yeah.
So we have another question. Do you have any thoughts on more informal methods of data collection, like a questionnaire distributed through an email listserv or something like that?
Yeah.
Less
I'm glad you
expensive
asked
options.
that. And it's a good segue to the next session. You can certainly do it. You're unlikely to get funding from what I would call, scientific foundations or those who are oriented towards sciencey kind of research, because the problem is when you don't have a random sample, then it's a hard case to make that you can use probability theory to make any inferences that are generalizable from something like that. And so that wouldn't really fall, it's not that you can't apply for funding to do that, it wouldn't probably qualify in the minds of most of these funders as kind of systematic quantitative research. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but it would be seen as more descriptive or even qualitative. You can do that kind of thing as at the level of a pilot study, though. You can say something like it's not, feasible financially, or logistically to do a systematic random sample because for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to do this email survey, or I'm going to use a convenience sample. I'm going to stand on a street corner and talk to whoever will talk to me, distribute my survey. But then you have to have a plan for what you're going to do beyond that. That will make it seem like that's going to lead somewhere to some kind of standard type of data set. This is actually an interesting issue for the region too, because unfortunately the standards to which American especially, but this might be true in Europe as well. Funders of social science research hold survey researchers on sampling are, often are kind of they just don't reflect the realities on the ground. Like we just might not be able to get a complete list of all the addresses, for example, to draw a random sample. And list, we don't have useful voter rolls that actually tell us where people really live, or that kind of stuff. If you listen to the sampling webinar, I actually talk about how to deal with that. So that's one way. But I think that's ultimately a problem with sampling, is what you're talking about. The other problem with the informality idea is, again, we're talking about relatively large dollars, and so you also want to show some systematicity in your approach to measurement. So again, pilot research, exploratory research, informal approaches to measurement are okay. But when you're asking an agency for tens, hundreds, even millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, you need to convince them that you've already figured out the measurement side of things and you don't need to use informal methods. Any other questions?
Yes, we do have some more questions. So we have a question. Should one briefly mention one's relevant professional background in a region to show their competence? Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah, you want to tell them not only why should the research be done, but why are you the one who should do it. And so if it's going to demonstrate competences or connections that are going to facilitate the research, then it's perfectly appropriate to mention that. You might not want to go into, and I've seen this more than once, a long thing about your family history and your passion for the region. That's not going to sell.
Don't get too personal. Yeah.
Yeah, don't get too personal.
Yeah, and usually the grant, the request for proposals will have specific guidelines on what they want to hear.
That's right.
But as someone who is part of a selection process, they always look at your level of investment in the region. And we can do one more now before we move on.
Okay.
Excuse me. Does what has been said to this point apply comfortably to projects that are historically based? For example, one that seeks to collect and analyze a fairly large body of data amassed over 50 to 80 years by the Russian Empire.
Oh, you can absolutely do that. And in fact, I should have mentioned that as an example. I thought I did think about it. Yeah. I mean, so I'm, just for brevity purposes, thinking of giving examples that are based on the idea that you're going to do surveys of contemporary populations. But you can survey any entity that there's a population of and that you can sample from, or you can collect or collect data. In that case, if you have information about a population that's systematic and that you could do statistical research with, by all means apply for data to do that. I'll give an example not from Eurasia, but my favorite example of this is someone I went to graduate school with, Melissa Wild, who's now a professor at University of Pennsylvania, actually got a grant to for the first time collect and put into a make a database of all of the votes ever taken during Vatican II. The bishops that convened, it was over like a 7-year period, were voting over and over and all this kind of stuff, but it was all on paper and no one had actually ever, taken that information and made a database of it, and she did that, and it's amazing the work that she's doing now with it. So that would be, I think, comparable to what you're talking about. So as long as you can make the case that there is you have to think about just any other kind of quantitative research. What is the population of interest or the entity of interest, the unit of analysis, whether it's votes, organizations, births and deaths, or opinions. Whether the unit of analysis of region, a group, an organization, so you can use analogous principles that apply of everything I've just said and what I'm going to say in those cases. But the other thing that's also it also means that what I said about pitching quantitative research to the Eurasian audience, you can also use the same kind of rules of thumb for pitching quantitative research to let's say you're applying to any National Endowment for the Humanities to do this work. Again, you want to be able to speak their language to show them that you're doing something quantitative, but that it's relevant for the kinds of humanistic things that they care about. Okay, so I guess I overestimated how much I could do in the time that we have, so let me just move on. This will be online, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. This is just any effective proposal. Okay, so you can get this kind of advice from somebody else, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because there's lots of resources out there about just general grant writing. But, what's your research question? The other thing I want to say is it's best if you can encapsulate at least the first part of this, the first half of this, on the first page. If you don't get your reviewers' attention by the first page, they got so many of these things to review, they're going to skim and maybe not even read the rest of it. So you've got to get their attention. And the SSRC guideline for proposals says that as well. What are you actually? So I'm going to focus on what exactly will you do and what are you going to produce, because one other, I think, a common flaw in proposal by junior people is you spend a lot of time building up your theory and your literature review and developing your credentials and why what you're doing is so interesting, but you don't give enough time to what you're going to do. I see the same thing in dissertation proposals. So it's a common sort of junior level mistake. A good proposal, whether it's a dissertation proposal or a grant proposal, in my opinion, at least half of it, as a rule of thumb, should be about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, not just why you want to do it and what's interesting about it. And then it's to one of the early questions: why should you be the one to do it, and why should the funder pay for it? Okay, so what does it have to do with the funder's own goals? So now for quantitative proposals, this is the other thing. If there's one thing you'll come away from this with, especially the graduate students, effective quantitative proposals, you need to think about it in terms of research design rather than statistics. And this is a common, I think, thing. People conflate what these things are. You can know a lot about statistics and very little about research design. And the statistics you can learn, statistics, are complex and, it takes a lot of training. But research, if you don't know how to design a good research project, then you're going to be wasting your time with your statistical analysis. And so funders know this, and they really want to know about the research design. They want to know about the statistics too, but they really want to know about the research design. And so by that I mean there should be, there should be an elegant and tight fit between what your questions are, how you define the concepts implicit in the question, how you're going to measure those concepts, how you relate those concepts to each other and hypotheses, and then how you're going to test those hypotheses with your measures using what kinds of statistical models. Okay, so all that has to fit together, and if it doesn't, if any piece there is missing or doesn't fit, then you don't have a successful proposal. So what do I mean about what you're going to do? What data will you collect if applicable? Okay, now that's not going to be true for all of you. How are you going to ensure the data quality, and how are you going to analyze it? And if you can weave in references back to your kind of more theoretical component of your proposal, that's going to make it much stronger. I want to say, by the way, that I'm happy to share. I'm going to be talking through an example from my last NSF proposal, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who wants to just email me. So you want to be really specific about what you're going to do. So this is what I would say are like kind of minimal sort of sections that need to be in a quantitative proposal. So the design of the instrument. And by instrument I mean questionnaire if we're talking about a population survey, but in the case of historical records, it's going to be more what kinds of records are they, and how are you going to transform those records from a bunch of paper and scattered information into something systematic that measures particular concepts. How are you going to collect the data? That matters for other kinds of decisions you make. And then showing that that you need to, it takes a lot of work to get an effective questionnaire together, and that you're going to work on. You've got plans to how allow time and resources for pre-testing and pilot testing. Pre-testing, the difference is just that pre-testing is it's not like a mock survey. It's just you have the questionnaire and you have a couple people sort of talk through it with them as they're trying to fill it out. It's like a cognitive interview. The pilot test is an actual kind of dry run of the whole thing, including the sampling and everything else. For sampling, and again, I'm just going to refer you back to my other webinar on this, but you need to talk about the sample size. This is actually one of the main determinants of cost, is your sample size, and so you really need to justify it. You need to make it large enough to where you'll have the statistical power to do what you want to do, but but also the smallest it can be to do that for cost considerations. Actual and by effective sample size, I mean once you take into account your sampling strategy, like if it's using like a multi-stage sampling strategy, that will actually reduce the statistical power. So again, I don't have time to go into it, but there's all in the other webinar. And then what's your sampling strategy? What's going to be your sampling frame? How are you going to draw your list of, make a list of the entities you might sample from, and then, how are you going to select them? Data collection, who's going to collect the data? How are you going to train them? And how are you going to make sure they're doing what you ask them to do? So that's also really important, especially when you're writing for, well, actually, what regional audiences are not. It's like, there's a lot of fraud in the region, okay? Probably here too, but there especially, you've got to make sure that you're not just having, people sitting at home filling out questionnaires, because they will do that. Some people will, if given the opportunity. So there are ways of preventing that. Likewise, are they actually go, for example, if you've sampled addresses and told them to go to a particular address, how do you know they're not just going to another one because there was nobody home? That kind of thing. That's the quality control. What kind of analytical techniques are you going to use? And you do need to say something about that, both because it's an important methodological decision, but also because it signals. What we're doing by laying all this out is signaling to the reviewer that you know what it takes and you have what it takes to actually carry this out and have some results. Okay, and then finally, data management plan. Actually, most of the federal agencies now require this. It's a formal requirement. How are you going to maintain the confidentiality and integrity of the data, meaning that it's not going to disappear or get corrupted? Sharing the data. This is a really, it's a nice way to pitch your project as having a value added beyond your actual, what you're going to do with it. So we always say that we're going to archive our data with the ICPSR, which is a consortium at University of Michigan that most major universities belong to, that has sort of best practices for preserving data, and it also makes it accessible to others. But you could also say you're going to make it available for free to anyone who wants to download it on the web. if you can give examples of the kinds of other kinds of research that somebody might want to use data for, then it's like it's more bang for their buck, right? If there could be more than one project that could benefit from it. Okay, so I'm actually going to just quickly just show you, I'm not going to give you time to read this. If you want to read it, you can, but this is, I just want you to see kind of the headings. Actually, maybe I'll go up. So like, we just quickly go through all of this. So this is our NSF proposal. So, here's introduction, concepts, core concept, housing status, go into it in detail. What else, what do we already know about housing effects, the kinds of housing effects that we're interested in? This is our literature review. What are the limitations of the existing work, and how are we going to solve the problem, and how does the Russian case solve the problem? Okay, then we give the background, assuming that they know absolutely nothing about Russia and that they don't care about it. Okay. Preliminary findings, if you have some, very helpful. Again, shows you've done your homework, that you're the right person and you're ready to do this work. Hypotheses, like lists of hypotheses can be very effective for these kind of science-y. You might not want to put a list like this in a proposal for, say, a more humanistic audience. Okay, basics of the research design, which we distinguish, I'll go back, but from the data collection and from data analysis. Okay, so there's design, collection, analysis. What's our unit of analysis? And we have several. We have individuals and households. We also have over time. What's our population of interest? In this case, we're interested in particular cohorts born during particular periods of time. And so we state what those are and we justify them. Here's a justification down here. Okay. We also want to interview not only the respondents, but family, spouses, and partners, and we justify that. Then, what are we actually going to do? So what's the questionnaire going to look like? What are the measures? And then how are we actually going to develop it? So who are we doing it with? Who are we collaborating with? If you can tell, we're in trouble now because we're working at the Law Center, but we're working through it. Expected, not just the sample size you hope for, but what's your expected rate of return, response rate, so that you should inflate your expected number of contacts you need to make accordingly. So, for a really complex survey, usually they're not going to expect you to have developed the full questionnaire yet, because that's what you're applying for funding to be able to do. Why would you do it if you're not going to ever be able to build it? But you should at least show that you've thought about measurement. Okay, so here are our core, concepts: quantity, quality, and tenure, parts of housing status, household structure, education, work. Okay, so these are all the things we've already developed hypotheses around all these things. We've already posed these as important, concepts for our work. Okay, and now we're talking about how we're going to measure it. Then there's the methodology. What's actually going to happen in the field? First, we have focus groups. This is a form of pilot research in a way. It's like how we're going to make sure we're using language that's going to resonate with people. Make sure that the things that we have a sense are important to people actually are. Now, to be honest, I kind of already knew the answers to these because I'd done 160 qualitative interviews for my last project, or 130, I'm sorry, but and analyze them. But this still was reassuring, I think, to the funders that we wouldn't be out of date on it, and we would also do it in different regions. How we're going to go about selecting and interviewing partners and parents. How we're going to go about our pre-testing, sampling, quality control. And again, these are all short because you only have so much space, but you want to get a little, at least show that you know that these things have to be dealt with, and give a sense that if they were to ask, if you had more space, you'd be able to say more about it. Okay, this proposal has very little on data analysis, and that's partly because we assumed that our audience, because there are other sociologists, would believe us that we know what we're doing because they can look at our publications and our training. For another audience, which that wasn't true, I'll show you quickly in a minute, we couldn't make that assumption, and so we spent a lot more time on that. And then here's the section on essentially somewhere we have, I think, no, it was separate. There was also a place where we could give bio sketches. It didn't have to be in a proposal itself, where we stated our qualifications. Okay, Now I'm just going to show you quickly another example where this is for an audience that we could presume probably can think in terms of, causation, understands causation, has some basic quantitative background, but might not be convinced that there's any value in causal modeling with survey data because it's not an experiment. So we knew that this was going to be our main obstacle. This is for the big grant we just got. And so what we did is we had a whole section on why we can still look at causation even though we can't do a true experiment. And our purpose here was really, again, to demonstrate that we thought it through. And to demonstrate what we thought would be for them actually probably unfamiliar approaches to show that social science can be this kind of, have this systematicity to it, that it's not just description. And so we don't assume that they know anything about particular kinds of models we're using. We use a combination of graphics, and again, this is just to show the people who like formulas that we can write a formula. Most people are going to gloss over that, but it's there for the ones who want it. We had more space here in order to do that as well. And then we had, we have several other strategies: instrumental variable models, propensity score matching. So, for this audience, the point is we tailored it to the audience. We put a lot of effort into what are we going to do with this data, and why will you be able to believe our findings? Why will the findings from this kind of data be useful? So, similar project, very different proposal. And that's really the key. That's, I think, the key is to not only you have to have a good idea, but you have to know how to essentially, it's basically marketing, market your idea to the different audiences. My last piece of advice is that is to be careful. Whoops, I just lost it again. Be careful what you wish for. And I say this only because if you do write a really terrific proposal and it gets funded, you don't want to be in a position of like, oh my gosh, now I have to do this and I'm not actually sure that I want to or that I can. Okay, and that can happen. And this has actually happened to me. I've recovered from it, but it was, I didn't expect that we would get that NSF the first time we applied. Usually you have to apply more than, you get rejected and then you reapply, right? And so I was not, we both were sort of shocked that we got it on the first try, and that meant a lot of stress for the first, 6 months of having to really just kind of clear our decks of the other things that we had already planned on doing, assuming we were. Was not a good assumption to make. Obviously it's a good problem to have. I mean, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that, it's worth thinking about. Is this the right time for you to do this research? Also, make sure that you have enough. It's going to be enough money for you to do it, and this is hard. And especially this is for the faculty. With the NSF project, we didn't have enough money to buy out our time. And that's made it really, really difficult to do. It feels like volunteer work sometimes because it's not like the rest of our obligations get reduced. We're still teaching the same amount we always have. Fortunately, we both had sabbaticals that were already scheduled, so we were able to deal with it. But if whatever agency you're applying to is willing to pay for your time, please make sure that you budget for that. And also, even though I said, don't be deterred if you're not from the most research-oriented institution, you do want to make sure that your institution is going to support you. Whether it's, if you're at a teaching institution, are they going to allow you to use those course releases that you applied for? Is it, you have to check and make sure that's even something you're allowed to do, is to buy out your time to work on a grant. Are you going to be able to travel enough to do field work if that's what needs to be done? Are you going to, even basic things like, are you going to have the kind of computers that you need as a funder, well, paper computers, that kind of thing. It's just worth thinking about. And then finally, and this is probably the most important, is, I've been talking all this about being strategic, but the only reason it's worth being strategic is in the interest of something that you really care about. I mean, I would be utterly miserable now if I had gotten all these grants and I wasn't interested in the topic and I had just done it just because I wanted to get some grants. That's not why most of us, go into scholarly research. So, be strategic, but, follow your heart and your interests as well. I'll stop there for any more questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, so if anyone has any additional questions, I'll give you a second to type those in. So while we're waiting to see if there's going to be any additional questions, I would just like to tell everyone that after the webinar later this week, I'm going to be sending out a link to a survey. And these surveys are actually very important to us, that as many people as possible participate in them. So if you would please, when you receive the link to the survey, it'll only take 5 minutes or less to fill out, so if you could please just fill that in, I would appreciate it very much. Okay, so far there's no additional questions.
All right, well, again, if anyone would like copies of my previous proposals or just, has any other questions, please feel free to email me at the University of Arizona.
And I'll make sure everyone has your email address when I send it out.
Okay. All right, thanks so much.
So thank you to Jane for another excellent webinar, and thank you to everybody for attending. Like we said, we'll be sending you a link to where you'll be able to find this webinar in a little while and to the rest of our webinars. And again, thank you very much and have a great day.